Look at the possum. Experience the existence of the possum. Now tell the possum your feelings, because that's as close as you're getting to therapy unless you marry someone who describes their income as comfortable and their lifespan as overdue to be quietly dispatched with a pillow to the face. The vast majority of us are just out here raw-dogging the daily tyranny of life with mental health that could be classed as bitey with a chance of crying in a parking lot. And while that's all well and good, so long as the litany of coping mechanisms we might employ to get through the day are working, it becomes very not good very fast when you find yourself at the intersection of your various and sundry mental illnesses and the crossing guard called distraction has been run down by the lifted Ford pickup called everything wrong with your brain on a neurochemical level. Even worse when you might keep foisting the corpse of said crossing guard onto the street because you're confused as to why your distraction techniques aren't operating as they should, a cycle that repeats until you either run out of crossing guards or the resulting pileup in your brain becomes unmanageable without professional intervention, which usually comes in the form of someone with doctor in front of their name weighing your pocketbook against a feather and condemning you to get the fuck out of their office. This could result in your wandering the streets at night in search of any numbing agent you can get your grubby little mitts on, and eventually you'll find yourself back where you started, but worse, likely having picked up a couple stomach issues, stress-related complications, and a penchant for sobbing that gives your affect a sporadically damp vibe and your family members cause for concern. If any of this sounds like you, if you've lived your entire life up to this point balancing your mental illnesses like it's some kind of party trick, but now you're struggling to cope and you don't know why, if you've been living under the weight of something that feels like apathy, but apathy usually goes away for you with time, and what you're going through is more like everything that used to make you happy now feels muffled, if the thought of engaging with interests and friends feels like looking at a grocery list, if your life was leached of its color until you didn't like anything at all, you looked forward to even less, and the gray wash over your existence became your new normal, if this feeling has just hung around like a second skin and days became weeks, became months, became years, if you're familiar with depression but this isn't the same, if something feels different this time and you just don't know what to do that isn't final and horrible and tempting in ways that it has never been before, if any of this sounds like you, if the thing that's different in your life isn't so much a potent increase in the bad so much as a near paralyzing decrease in the good, then let me introduce you to a concept that will hopefully put you in the first step to not spending the rest of your days with the hedonic tone of a toaster oven. Enter anhedonia, which the Mayo Clinic defines as an inability to experience pleasure from activities usually found enjoyable. Please take the Mayonnaise Institution's version of it with a grain of salt, because the actual experience of anhedonia is better defined as a, quote, diminished capacity to experience pleasure, according to Anhedonia, a concept analysis by Nancy Ho and Marilyn Summers, which should be a matter of common sense given that the complete absence of pleasure in life would lead to absolutely zero studies on the subject, since all available test subjects would have gently impaled themselves on the nearest available fork. The only reason I brought up the less accurate definition is that descriptions like that are still the first thing you'll see when you Google this condition, and that could very well lead many of you to ruling it out as an explanation for why everything good in your life just started to suck, meaning you'd bumble about like business as usual, even though your current emotional bandwidth is, what if drying paint could walk and pay taxes? This issue ruined my life for 2 years before I ever knew what it was, thinking all the while that my depression had just sprouted another head like a fucking hydra, and in hopes of saving you some of the time that I can't get back, key features of anhedonia include, but are not limited to, looking forward to fuck all, hobbies and interests that used to make you happy feel about as pleasant as licking a handrail, and the general state of your life, which was perhaps somewhat manageable if you squint, has now become a monotonous plod, everything that used to be fun results in emotional grayscale, and the coping mechanisms that you used to employ to get through the bad times are now your everyday numbing agent to distract you from the growing sense that, if given the opportunity, you are going to do something that is going to end in a rush slideshow of every candid of you ever taken, along with a backtrack entitled Top Songs to Play After Someone Has Launched Themselves Off a Mid-Sized Office Building. This is a mental state that I called the Big Gray Box long before I knew what anhedonia was, and if any of this sounds similar to the experience of depression, you're not wrong, given that it co-occurs in 37% of people who shouldn't own a gas-powered oven, but please put that to the side for now because it's going to come up later and I need you to focus if we're going to get your brain to produce chemicals more potent than a boiled egg. Starting with Section 1, the different types of anhedonia. Research is mixed on the official number of subtypes, but Britannica boils them down to physical, social, anticipatory, consummatory, motivational, and decisional. We're going to throw out most of those as a repetitive waste of your time and leave the two most important that you're likely to have. This leaves us with anticipatory and consummatory anhedonia. And we'll start with the anticipatory variety, the professional definition of which is roughly reduced expectations of pleasure from things you previously enjoyed, leading to, quote, reduced motivation to participate in pleasurable activities, as found in the same source we just brought up. A layman's example of which would be a person who previously loved to read, suddenly thinking that reading doesn't sound that fun at all, as if they weren't previously barreling through fairy smut like they were doing field research on how to properly knob-gobble their way through the entire unseelie court. The simplest version of it is apt to the name of the subtype itself, as people with anticipatory anhedonia do not anticipate as much pleasure in things they used to enjoy. It can feel like you've suddenly lost much or all of your interest in them, often leading you to not engage in those activities. The key point is that it both lasts a long time and it isn't the natural boredom that comes from growing tired of something. Too long didn't listen, anticipatory anhedonia will tell your brain that you in fact wouldn't enjoy all the stuff you used to like. This can sap your motivation to do those things since you've been convinced that it won't be fun, and if left untreated long enough, can result in a kind of identity crisis where you're wondering who you even are anymore, generally accompanied by sporadic attempts to get your brain to produce anything other than a vaguely beige sense that you have the frequency of a potted plant. Don't expect brevity from this bastion of verbosity, and while we're still on the topic, it's crucial to note that someone with anticipatory anhedonia is still capable of experiencing pleasure if they do the thing that should make them happy. The primary issue is that they usually don't get to that point since their brain is telling them it's going to be unrewarding. Hopefully explaining it 5 different times has managed to penetrate the brain soup some of you have been swimming in since the global experiment to see how many people could drown in their own lungs before capitalism deemed it damaging to the bottom line. And to keep you from considering the diverse ramifications of a mass culling on a global scale, we'll be transitioning to the second of the 2 most important anhedonias, the consummatory variety, the definition of which is said to be, quote, decreases in the experience of pleasure, meaning that while you may anticipate enjoying things you previously liked, actually engaging in them feels nowhere near as good as it used to. This should again not be mixed up with natural boredom from repetition, but is rather a broad and significant reduction in pleasure from doing things that you used to like across the board. The point is that consummatory anhedonia essentially turns down the dial on your capacity for experiencing said pleasure while engaging with things that you should like. And in this case, the person whose reading list looks like a sequence of eggplant emojis actually does expect to enjoy themselves, but upon cracking the spine, feels like they may as well be reading the Farmer's Almanac. So as a refresher on what you've learned so far, anticipatory anhedonia makes you think you won't enjoy the things you like, and consummatory anhedonia can actually make them suck. It's possible to have one type or both. And now that you understand the very key difference between the two, we can move on to Section 2, as well as return to that 37% statistic. Welcome to depression and anhedonia, otherwise known as one incredibly likely reason your neuroactivity has recently descended into a series of fetch quests, and all of them are coming back with paper clips in last month's edition of things to do while sitting on the toilet. For the minute number of you who found your way to this side of the internet but somehow don't know what depression is, first, what's that like? And second, the American Psychiatric Association defines it as a, quote, common and serious medical illness that negatively affects how you feel, the way you think, and how you act, going on to say that it can cause symptoms like feeling sad, guilty, changes in appetite, trouble with or oversleeping, fatigue, restlessness, slowed movements or speech, difficulty thinking, and thoughts of unsubscribing from having to live through yet another year of franchise reboots given to directors that I wouldn't trust with my pet rock. The same source says it's, quote, estimated to affect 1 in 15 adults a year, 1 in 6 will experience it before they croak, and the overall brain feel is like carrying around an albatross that hates you, who won't shut up about how you're a disappointment to your family and should probably have made a U-turn the moment your mother shot you out of her sacred kazoo. That 37% stat comes from a study called Anhedonia and Schizophrenia and Major Depression by Lorenzo Palizza and Alberto Ferrari, published in 2009, which says that anhedonia was found in 36.9% of subjects with major depression. This finding was long before the entire world held a prolonged game of how much fluid in the lungs is too much before life expectancy drops to a disturbing wheeze. I'd say it's it's reasonable to posit that the pool of depressed people has increased since such a globally traumatizing event, along with furthered societal acceptance of people seeking treatment for mental illness, causing more to step forward. I wouldn't be surprised if the percentage of people suffering from co-occurring anhedonia went up along with those factors. You'll recall that there was a roughly 60% portion that weren't experiencing anhedonia with their depression back in 2009. So bare minimum, it's more than a little likely that there's an entire sector of people who have been living with depression all their lives but are dealing with anhedonia for the first time, which leaves them wide open to get dog-walked by a condition they don't even know they have. Returning to Ho and Sommer's work, the real kicker that comes from having anhedonia and depression at the same time is that while anticipatory and consummatory anhedonia give people a quote reduced capacity to experience pleasure, they don't affect the quote ability to experience pain, general stimulation, and negative emotions like sadness. Removing important positive experiences from someone already suffering from a consistently negative mental state is like taking someone's snorkel and replacing it with a straw. It's just as unsurprising for a person with depression and undiagnosed anhedonia to feel like they're metaphorically drowning. And worse still, whether you're dealing with either variety of anhedonia, its presence alone can easily convince a depressed patient to not even seek out pleasant activities, because the squishy thing in their skull is telling them that all the things they used to like will feel about as gratifying as sitting in traffic. Depression comes with symptoms like lethargy, feelings of worthlessness, and difficulty concentrating, so they're combating that new development with the executive function of a spork, resulting in a state where bad feelings outweigh the good by default, and they're left to captain a theoretical ship that's taking on water. The crew members are madly scooping with slotted spoons, some are actively bailing liquid onto the deck, and others are pondering why they're even trying when the reward is simply continuing to sink, but at a rate that is slightly slower than your average rascal scooter. To bring it down to the chemical level and give you a better understanding of what's going on in between your earbuds, as per an article from 2018 called Conceptualizing Anhedonias and Implications for Depression Treatment, anhedonia in patients with major depression has been postulated to be the quote result of functional deficits associated with dopaminergic transmission, especially in the mesolimbic and mesocortical dopaminergic pathways. Those of you who just felt your eyes cross in the middle of that sentence can process it as your brain's dopamine bank account holding a balance of get bent. Dopamine, as per the same article, is said to have quote effects on reward anticipation, learning, motivation, and wanting of pleasurable stimuli. You can roughly translate it as a chemical in your head that's really important in experiencing pleasure or feeling a sense of accomplishment after doing a task, since your gray matter is supposed to release that shit in order to motivate you to do anything other than lie down and rot. And you could easily understand why having a brain that's mismanaging the supply of dopamine and or releasing a peasant's ransom of it at irregular intervals could lead someone to feel like their next best move involves an unguarded light socket, a fork, and voltage sufficient to render any EMTs as presumptuous at best. Returning to those polysyllabic pathways, the mesolimbic pathway is involved in quote learning, reward, motivation, and reinforcement, while the mesocortical pathway is involved in quote working memory, attention, and executive functioning. Deficits or poorly managed amounts of dopamine in said pathways will fuck your shit right up. And the reason I've gone all Miss Frizzle on you and taking you on a short journey at the molecular level is that many of you who are or have previously suffered from depression will be familiar with the common practice of psychiatrists opening your gullet and shoving in as many SSRIs as it takes to keep you from twerking in oncoming traffic. Which is an issue when, returning to anhedonia, a concept analysis, depressed patients with anhedonia typically do not respond to first-line medication therapies for major depressive disorder. The first thing many psychiatrists will deploy are the aforementioned SSRIs/selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, something that becomes a problem when you find that, quote, it has been shown that the administration of SSRIs, such as these two medications that I can't pronounce here, induced a decrease in dopamine neuron firing rates in the ventral tegmental area, which is basically where dopamine spawns from. The VTA has direct involvement with the mesolimbic and mesocortical pathways mentioned earlier. So being put on a medication that reduces dopamine spawn rate while you have anhedonia is not only unlikely to help your treatment-resistant depression, given that it's been affirmed that medical solutions for depression, quote, focus largely on reducing excesses in negative affect rather than improving creating deficits in positive effect, it becomes really easy to see why patients with coexisting anhedonia can report feeling numb while on such medications, since dopamine levels are not being raised simultaneously. That bit of alphabet soup was based in Treatment for Anhedonia, a neuroscience-driven approach, and the translation is, while you may have managed to make your depressed patient feel slightly less bad, their ability to feel good is still being seriously blunted because of anhedonia. So now they're just walking around like there's a layer of static between them and emotionally processing their environment, the result of which is a mental state that sits somewhere between uninhibited sock puppet and aborted lobotomy. Again, it's been established that, quote, anhedonia can exist with or without feelings of sadness, so it's not going to just shuffle off the moment you've given someone's brain enough chemicals to get them to stop actively weeping. Not feeling anything that strongly can be just as bad, and this leaves a massive opening for much-needed treatment focused on increasing positives that aren't drawn from street drugs or buying frog-shaped everything until you've drawn in every tortured bisexual in the tri-state area. I've dedicated an entire section of this essay to effective treatments at the end, so don't flip out just because I deliver info with the comforting vibes of a cheese grater slip and slide. And on a related note, this state of dopamine dysregulation is the perfect point to introduce the third section of the evening on reasons your life might be going down the toilet that could be entitled, What If We Took Everything We've Learned Here Today and Somehow Made It Worse? What if I told you that, quote, 30 to 40% of individuals diagnosed with depression also have ADHD? Something that should be unsurprising, as nearly half of people with ADHD have depression, but it remains somewhat niche knowledge in many sectors since the majority of researchers conveniently excluded half the population of the planet in their studies, which is a great way to cut down on your workload since you don't have to consider unimportant stuff like possible differences in symptom presentation or the disturbing fact that not everything has to be modeled on the gender most likely to violently helicopter the contents of their pants. I swear this complaint will make sense in a second, and I've saved this section for last for several reasons, that being one, that the signs and symptoms of depression are most recognizable on a universal scale. Two, ADHD often goes undiagnosed in AFAB people until they're well into adulthood due to the majority of studies and information on the issue being aimed at boys and men. And three, perhaps the most frustrating thing I've learned throughout working on this essay, untreated ADHD can lead to depression, which can lead to anhedonia. This disorder is the center of the Russian nesting doll I've been taking apart before your eyes, each layer revealing a creative way your brain might be managing its resources if you take managing to mean dicking about and setting the occasional filing cabinet on fire. And in order to discern if this unholy three-way of anhedonia, depression, and ADHD is the reason your life has gone off the rails and crashed into a ditch full of orphans, we'll need to familiarize you with attention deficit/hyperactivity disorder beyond the 50 videos about it on your FYP. Welcome to the actual title of Section 3, which is basically a crash course on ADHD. Sit down, no one said you could leave. I'm aware of the brutal irony of addressing this in long-form format, but any attempt to condense all of these issues into a 20-second video that you could play at 2 times speed would inevitably leave something important out. I'm hoping to help you recognize any symptoms you might find in yourself and, once more, save you time that I can't get back. I'll tie in how it factors into co-occurring depression and anhedonia once I'm satisfied that you have enough information to deliver a TED Talk to an unsuspecting stranger that's long enough to make them consider violence. And to put it in the simplest form, as per the Cleveland Clinic, ADHD is a, quote, long-term chronic brain condition that causes executive dysfunction. Executive dysfunction, per the same source, is a behavioral symptom that disrupts a person's ability to manage their own thoughts, emotions, and actions. Ideal executive function can be thought of as a steering wheel that allows you to decide what to do/where to go and then act on it. The dysfunctional variety swaps the steering wheel for bees, and sometimes, if the person with ADHD is lucky, they will stop their erratic little dances long enough to allow us to perform basic tasks without someone chasing us around with a weed whacker coated in cayenne pepper. The neurochemical level of this disorder sees issues similar to anhedonia, being that the number of receptors related to dopamine are, quote, decreased in the frontal lobes of individuals with ADHD, which is from this paper by several researchers whose names I won't won't deign to butcher. I'll remind you that dopamine and its efficient transmission is directly related to feeling good, motivation, and reward anticipation. And it's integral for those pathways in your skull directly involved with learning, working memory, and surviving in a society where being bad at any of those things means you don't get to eat. Such a dysregulation of dopamine creates difficulty for those with it to, quote, manage their behavior, pay attention, control overreactivity, regulate their mood, stay organized, concentrate, follow directions, and make it to the end of this sentence without feeling their teeth itch. I may have added that last bit myself. And the disorder is further broken down into 3 presentation styles, which will be getting their own little sections in order to make them more distinct to you than the vague notion that most people with ADHD have the affect of a sugar glider on cocaine. Starting with the first out the gate, the predominantly inattentive presentation, which is most common for AFAB people and according to the Cleveland Clinic includes symptoms like difficulty focusing, organizing, and staying on track starting in childhood. And this article on the National Library of Medicine goes further in saying that the symptoms can also include not paying close attention to tasks, missing small details, rushing through tasks, not seeming to listen when spoken to, difficulty organizing things, not finishing work, disliking or avoiding tasks that take sustained mental effort, losing things, or having the working memory of a Nintendo 64 after a small child has shoved an entire sandwich into its cartridge compartment. My youngest brother may have been the genesis of that joke, and I remain salty about it to this day. This brings us to the second subtype of ADHD, known as the predominantly hyperactive impulsive presentation, i.e. the style most commonly diagnosed in boys and men for a variety of factors that I'll get to in a bit. And turning to the hilariously named CHAD organization that was linked by the CDC, symptoms of this variety include excessive fidgeting, difficulty remaining seated, extreme restlessness in adults, trouble being quiet, feeling like you're being driven by a motor, having a motor mouth to match, not waiting for someone to stop talking before blurting things out, and associated difficulty with waiting your turn, and thus interrupting people to the extent that talking to someone with this presentation style feels like a tennis match where one person refuses to relinquish the ball, proceeding to shove the ball into a tailpipe on impulse, the ball gets stuck, and in the middle of extraction, they have somehow climbed a nearby tree. Mind you, this manner of absconding into the foliage can be literal or figurative, given that our third and most prevalent subtype of ADHD is combined presentation. This takes the inattentive and hyperactive categories and smushes them together until they make you buy a bunch of planners you won't use, and amounts to the presentation style of roughly 70% of people with ADHD, which may leave some of you scratching your heads, given that I just told you that most AFAB people present predominantly inattentive. However, this discrepancy makes sense when you consider that women and girls report feeling more, quote, internal hyperactivity and other unrecognized symptoms with behaviors often ascribed to culturally very social girls, like excessive talking, fidgeting, impulsivity, intense daydreaming, difficulty sustaining friendships, self-harm, and strategies to cope with her unknown disorder that look a lot like staying up all night to finish an assignment that you've had 4 months to do and must now crank out in 4 hours, no sleep, and on enough Red Bull to stroke out a Jersey cow. I'm highlighting this because the gender bias in diagnosis leads many women to not even try to seek a diagnosis until, quote, some or all of their life is out of control, which is bad, and probably relevant to my majority AFAB audience, given that most of you are in your 20s and 30s, thus falling precisely into the sector most likely to lose their ever-loving shit after years of receiving fuck-all support. And once you contend with the fact that the more outwardly presented symptoms and the biased focus on their study has led the face of ADHD to be a hyperactive little boy, it's decently obvious that the early diagnosis of these symptoms is directly related to 1, a difference in symptom presentation, and 2, the gendered concepts surrounding boys will be boys. An idiom that Merriam-Webster says is used to indicate that it is not surprising or unusual when men or boys behave in energetic, rough, or improper ways. And while this is far from the entire picture, it does correlate to a reduced societal pressure for boys to sit still and behave, so they are more likely to express their symptoms in outward ways, thus leading to earlier diagnosis and appropriate assistance. There is no equivalent girls will be girls, and the pressure girls experience from a young age to quiet down and act like a lady can skew the noticeable presentation towards boys, which are a lot easier to distinguish when their gender conditioning hasn't prohibited them from jumping atop their desk and demanding a fist fight with God. Toss in the tidbit that ADHD is commonly first noticed by a child's teachers, and the text from this article with an absurdly long title that says In 2 studies where teachers were presented with ADHD-like vignettes/descriptions of symptoms with nothing changed but the pronouns of the child involved, quote, boys' names were more likely to be referred for additional support and considered more suitable for treatment. What you get is an incredibly biased focus on boys with little to no focus on girls, even if they are presenting the same symptoms, girls who will then grow into incredibly dysregulated adults dealing with a disorder that, if left untreated, can cause, quote, persisting dysfunction and devastating consequences, included but not limited to long-term inability to work, increased car accidents, and substance abuse. Substance abuse, which is also commonly linked to anhedonia, as per this source, which is a given as you continuously put pressure on those pleasure receptors in search of a feeling of general well-being. To put it simply, too many girls are left to just fall through the cracks, as according to the CHAD organization, they're diagnosed with ADHD at just under half the rate at which boys are diagnosed. But the difference is made up for in adulthood, where women and men are diagnosed with ADHD at roughly the same rate, meaning AFAB people are being left to struggle until their entire life is in flames, in full or in part because their parents placed them in a pink onesie on the day they were born. That's not even touching on the other identities on top that make getting diagnosed even harder, given that it's common knowledge that being poor, brown, or operating outside a cisgender binary is going to make access to quality healthcare look like climbing Everest in flip-flops. So if you're seeing yourself in any of the symptoms I've described, if your life has been in shambles for so long and to such an extent that you've been too embarrassed to reach out for fear of feeling stupid or judged or picked apart or told for the 100th time that you're just not trying hard enough, I want you to know that no part of this is your fault. You were failed at so many turns by a system that wasn't even set up to acknowledge that you exist. You made it this far into your life undiagnosed and without the supports you needed to function in an already challenging world, all while carrying the additional challenges of your race, class, gender, or sexuality on your back. And you deserve to know that not only are you not a failure, every struggle you've borne up to this moment is proof that you fought back despite the odds. I understand if you don't believe me. If you're still struggling under the burdens of hyperproductive expectations, hustle culture, and that you might really believe in the idea that all you need to do is work harder. I get that maybe that's even given you a sense of control in a world where the odds of achieving any kind of security seem to be getting starker by the day. However, if I could take a moment to give you a piece of validation, I'd like to show you just how much you've accomplished just by making it this far. So if you'll sit with me for a bit, I'll tell you a short story. I lost my younger brother nearly 2 decades ago, and even though he passed as a teenager, I always think of him as a rambunctious little boy in my head. He was so small and scrawny and always getting into some kind of trouble. He loved playing video games, had terrible grades, a great best friend, and when he wasn't gallivanting around our property with his older brother, who he followed absolutely everywhere, he could be found at our dad's heels, learning what he could, and when bored, shoving the occasional sandwich in a cartridge compartment. The baby of the family gets away with everything, it seems. I still remember, in the dark of night, at 2 a.m., I once caught him trying to set our upstairs bookcase on fire. And many years later, after I'd done enough research on ADHD for this essay, I found myself recalling the memory of my little brother, and a question came to mind unbidden. Is the impulsivity of ADHD a suicide risk factor? It's common knowledge that it's a matter of an incredibly heightened state. Maybe the buildup is over months and years, but usually the actual motivation to act on it will abate if the person doesn't have immediate access to the proper tools or environment to carry it out. We've all heard the stories of people regretting their jump mid-leap. It's been described as a powerful but impermanent impulse because it takes a lot to overwhelm an instinct to survive, to sever your ties to those who love you, to a world that will notice when you're gone. Such a strong impulse it must be. Is the impulsivity of ADHD a suicide risk factor? The question was chilling. My brain had already made the connection, and the answer, despite my silent pleas otherwise, was yes. There is a positive association between ADHD and suicidality in both sexes and in all age groups. This quote comes from the NIH article, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, A Systematic Review, which was the result of its authors' processing of 5 databases for correlating studies addressing suicide and ADHD. They found the risk obviously goes up if you have co-occurring disorders like depression. I still recall my eyes skimming over the words. They found a positive association between ADHD and completed suicides in males. The results had come from psychological autopsy studies of teenage and young adult self-deletion events, as well as long-term follow-up studies of ADHD children, saying it could increase the risk for suicide through comorbid conditions. Conditions like depression, like the mental illness that roughly half of people with ADHD develop and is worsened depending on environmental, interpersonal, and neurological factors. A mental illness that can make dealing with an already difficult world even harder. Our dad died of a heart attack when my youngest brother was no more than 8 years old. We lost our home the following year because my mother couldn't make ends meet with 4 children to feed, and somewhere between the grief and instability, my brother slipped away before he could celebrate his 15th birthday. A National Library of Medicine article says that ADHD is one of the most heritable conditions in terms of psychiatric disorders. I'm his sister, and I was diagnosed with ADHD in December of 2023. And siblings have twice the risk of having ADHD than the general population. One by one, those characteristics came to mind from over the course of my research. His hyperactivity, struggles in school, tumultuous social relationships, impulsive and reckless behavior, and finally, the way he left us, his life taken by his own hand. And the answer was sitting in front of our faces all this time, but I was too young. Too busy keeping my own personal overpass at bay, teetering ever on the edge, incapable of spotting symptoms for a disorder I'd never heard of. And I left that house before my youngest brother reached the culmination of that slow-moving crisis that swallowed him up and took his life. Is the impulsivity of ADHD a suicide risk factor? We both know the answer. He was undiagnosed to his final day, but I know what crept away with him now. And this is what I mean when I say that you having made it this far is so far from meaningless. Because you've been dealing with something that swallows people whole, that can strike entire families with grief, leave lives in a state of wreckage, dash your potential on the rocks, and all the while you'll be asked to continue, despite the odds. And as you've learned before, or perhaps for the first time today, not all of us make it that far. So give yourself a fucking break and maybe some credit for surviving under direct fire from a neurochemical state that makes a natural disaster look like a rainy day. Now that I've properly ruined your day, and to round out this crash course before getting back to the casserole of mental issues you might have been cooking up, we'll move on to Section 4, ADHD, as seen specifically in adults. This bit is necessary since the prevailing image of an annoying little snot is still the primary impression people have of ADHD and its symptoms, to the extent that even the CDC shunts the section on adults to the very bottom of its article on the disorder, to which it dedicates one measly paragraph. I'm going to ignore this major government agency's absolute negligence and help you recognize any symptoms that evolved for you since childhood, starting with the fact that the externally obvious symptoms of ADHD change with age, as both AMAB and AFAB people experience pressure to behave in a certain way in order to not get politely but firmly told to stop being a giant pain in the ass. I'm about to list some signs and symptoms likely to appear in people old enough to vote, drink, or be held legally liable for trying to do both at the same time, so set down your emotional support beverage and do try to focus long enough that you don't have to rewind the video 5 times. The National Library of Medicine remarks that the core symptoms seen in childhood, quote, may be missing in adults, and they may manifest as other problems such as procrastination, mood instability, and low self-esteem. They will likely be more impulsive in nature or inattentive, as the hyperactivity symptoms can be better controlled. And WebMD says that this slew of issues caused by untreated ADHD can translate to the person dealing with them feeling incredibly incredibly overwhelmed, as well as a history of anxiety and depression in adults as symptoms persist. Factors which the CHAD organization says can pile on the stress, the long-term effects of which can be lowered immune system function, stomach and intestinal conditions, fatigue, brain fog, weight gain or loss, reproductive disorders, and aggravated depression or anxiety that overall produces a feeling that's described as being on edge, better described as the devastating knowledge that you can't accomplish anything that matters consistently, your life is amounting to little more than an itemized receipt, and whatever you do to try to change it feels like building a sandcastle in front of an oncoming wave. The wave has a personal vendetta against you specifically, everyone else is building their structures just fine, and no one can understand why you're constantly showing up damp, upset, and results that present a tad on the side of sad-looking lump. It's likely that you've tried scheduling, alarms, calendar tricks, and or everything besides hooking up your left tit to a car battery to motivate you to get things done. You've been screaming at yourself to quote-unquote do the things since as long as you can remember with no results. And given that this dysregulation compounds with time and coexisting conditions, you may as well have been trying to build your sandcastle underwater and with powdered sugar. A concept that gives us the perfect opportunity to finally tie this clusterfuck together before your patience starts leaking out your ears. Congrats on making it to Section 5 and the absolute car crash that is having anhedonia, depression, and ADHD all at the same time. Please don't look at the remaining runtime, it will only cause you pain. To recap, I've put you through biology, gender bias and medical science, the loss of a loved one, and now we're here at the true center of it all. Because if you really iron it all down and tuck in the finer details and branching pathways of these three disorders, the through line becomes really clear. Untreated ADHD gives you a 50% chance of having depression, both of them are capable of spawning anhedonia, and having all three of them will make you want to stick a tire iron in the chest cavity of whatever god thought this would be an acceptable state of being. It's like a 1-2-3 punch to the figurative and sometimes literal gut, given the gastrointestinal consequences from prolonged untreated mental issues, which give rise to prolonged untreated stress, which can culminate in a hospital visit with a partial blockage between your esophagus and stomach while you're dressed like a backup dancer for Jim and the fucking holograms. That strangely specific example aside, while this section is to do with the overlap between the main three, you can have any combination of them and still be in desperate need of an appropriate amount of dopamine in your system. This part of the essay will thus still serve you well whether you have 2 or 3 of the collectible disorders, and I'm saying all of this in a nice and level tone because half of you look ready to bolt, and if I have to tell you to sit back down one more time, so help me, I will call in 515 and hold my finger over the 0. Quick reminder that dopamine has direct relation to pleasure, reward sensitivity, and motivating yourself to do anything other than make an ever-deepening impression in the dirt. We are currently trying to put the pieces together and hopefully form a quick snapshot of how and why having anhedonia, depression, and ADHD could have sent your life into a tailspin, so this part may have the answer you're looking for. And if you've been starting to think you may have all three and are wondering why that's made everything so goddamn awful, here's how it may have snuck up on you and cacked you in the back of the head. Because undiagnosed ADHD, leading to depression, leading to anhedonia, is kind of like a dam that's been developing cracks, letting in more water until it eventually bursts. The initial crack is the ADHD. Your motivation to get things done is fickle and frustrating, and your mismanaged levels of dopamine cause you constant stress to meet expectations both large and small. Shame and guilt follow with repeated failure or struggle. The second crack is depression, prolonged and unaddressed. Its associated symptoms like brain fog, lethargy, and immense despair take a system that was already being managed by 5 raccoons in a trench coat and throws a bucket of water over the entire operation. Dopamine is further lowered by default, making it even harder to accomplish things. Coping strategies like abuse of caffeine, sleep deprivation, and reliance on high sugar and salt foods to boost mood and motivation increase as you try to keep afloat. This could last for years, but these coping mechanisms get less potent as functional aids with time. And then the third crack hits. The anhedonia sets in, dopamine management hits rock bottom, and all those things that you used to do to get your brain to let you function don't fucking work. The motivation boost you need for your ADHD? Anhedonia isn't associated with reward insensitivity for no reason. The mood boost you need to balance out your depression? Anhedonia kneecaps your ability to offset the extreme sadness with positive feelings. Negative emotional responses are now the majority by default. Good luck doing anything with your life when the reward is enjoying nothing and living like some kind of empty husk of who you used to be. Boom, there goes your barely functioning dam. To put this doom spiral in a different perspective, the way this cycle perpetuates your sinking further into dysfunction with time is equally insidious if you look at it from top down. First, the anhedonia causes you to feel less pleasure from things you previously enjoyed, making you less likely to do them. This makes the sadness of depression even deeper since you go without positive experiences to balance it out. And with the motivation to do things already delicate before, given the ADHD, when you put anhedonia and depression on top, the resulting feedback loop creates a self-feeding cycle wherein you're frozen from lack of dopamine, depressed, anhedonia's blunting your coping strategies, you're not sure you'll ever enjoy anything again, and the end result is an ongoing identity crisis just potent enough to stall your entire life, wreck your future, and give you the energetic frequency of a linoleum floor. In short, it's no wonder you're fracking struggling. You've been caught in a triple bind, and if you're residing in America, the cavalry only shows up when you're a certain socioeconomic bracket, and even then, they might ride away if they spy a boob. A point that brings us to our sixth section of the evening. Now that I've given you a bunch of stuff that could be wrong with you with the tone of someone whose empathetic range is giving "please leave a message after the beep," what else could possibly go wrong? Welcome to Section 6, Late-Stage Capitalism and the Medicalization of Distress. I really should get someone else to write my titles, given that they have the bedside manner of a lead balloon. We're going to be covering what could have turned your life upside down, outside of your brain being about as plugged in as a wireless remote. And this part of the essay is best understood as a mixture between the environment that spawns and/or exacerbates mental illness, while the next section will be focused on treatment with that context in mind. Some of you are actively eyeing the door, which I understand but will not forgive. And to unpack exactly what medicalization of distress even means, we'll be looking at an aptly named paper entitled "Medicalizing Distress, Ignoring Public Health Strategies," which, if you'll uncross your eyes for a second, explains that the medicalization of distress has resulted in a focus on treating individuals. It has also resulted in ignoring the impact of social and economic stress on mental health, resulting in very little emphasis on the need for and use of public health and population-based interventions. Plainly put, what this entails is, instead of addressing broad-reaching issues in society like rising cost of living, associated overwork, food insecurity, polluted environments, community design that breeds isolation, and intense monetary paywalls between the majority of the populace and necessary healthcare and support, which is causing people to react appropriately with poor mental health, the focus is instead put on diagnosing the individual as if their mental or physical issues are occurring in a vacuum and are not coming from or made worse by an environment that is making them ill. I did an entire video on fat shaming that goes into the effects of an environment of prolonged stress and shame if you're looking for a deeper dive, and the gist of how it could be affecting you in this context is that if you're overworked, underpaid, time and energy poor, living in a polluted area, and you don't have anything left in you at the end of the day other than a couple ramen packets and the grueling notion that you have to get up tomorrow and do it all again, your despair is a normal human reaction to those circumstances. There's no psychiatric treatment to get your job to pay you enough to live or reduce your hours so you have enough time to properly care for yourself and engage with things that make life worth living. There's no pill to keep your rent from getting raised, yet people still have to swallow paying an 8% increase on an apartment that hasn't been serviced since the silent generation popularized a popcorn ceiling. And when the culture of mental health care focuses specifically on treating the symptoms and not the environment that created or worsened them, what you get is a state where a person is being subtly told that their struggle is purely in their own head, said skull can be righted with enough medication, and then everyone gets all surprised Pikachu-faced when Zoloft doesn't fix their patient's response to living in a society that's set up to keep them laboring away like some kind of workhorse until they either lose value, or God pulls a never-ending story and the proverbial glue factory gets replaced with the aptly named Swamp of Despair. This, of course, isn't 100% spent on healthcare practitioners, as they don't control the economy and usually can't do anything about the rising difficulty of life in a system built to drain the vast majority of the population dry, but the sense that those seeking mental health care are doing so because there's just something wrong with them specifically prevails, with little attention paid to the bleak quality of life patients are often experiencing, specifically due to disenfranchisement, prejudice, poverty, and wider societal abandonment, if not outright antagonism. I.e., most people don't enjoy living in a building with more rats than tenants, 3 roommates, 2 service jobs, and no privacy while working a side hustle wherein they're forced to titillate greasy weirdos on the internet with pictures of their feet. There is no one who grows up with the childhood dream of being yelled at by Karens all day and then forced to stick their toes in corned beef hash at night. So it's kind of understandable that they're not feeling particularly funky or fresh when they roll into a psychiatrist's office 2 seconds from exploding into a cloud of emotional debris. Mind you, this isn't to say that mental illnesses don't occur despite ideal conditions, but more specifically, that a bad environment can cause, mimic, and/or intensify the experience of them. Toxic stress is corrosive to mental and physical health at minimum. This is especially relevant when viewing mental illness and the stress response to a bad environment through the lens of racial, gendered, sexuality-related, or socioeconomic factors. Meaning that, in short, being neurospicy is even more challenging if you're dirt poor, trans, a member of the alphabet mafia, or have a racial identity that makes loss prevention follow you around the store like they're waiting for you to grab an entire clothing rack and break into a sprint. And the resulting traumas that often rise from growing up at the cross sections of these identities, as well as living under the scrutiny of a society that has demonized them, further complicates separating nature from nurture when it comes to the treatment process. For example, the effects of long-term stress left unaddressed can look incredibly similar to ADHD, such as brain fog, irritability with assigned tasks, spacing out, depressed mood, poor working memory, trouble with sleep, and all sorts of health issues that arise from your fight or flight system being on constant call just so you don't collapse into a liably weeping heap. This can make the effects of prolonged duress difficult to detangle from disorder, since it's possible to experience both at the same time, meaning you could be stressed to fucking back while also inheriting the dopaminergic transmission of a Tiger electronic. Either way, it bears asking how much of your depression or ADHD is your brain fumbling dopamine and serotonin in a physical sense, and how much is a human reaction to being repeatedly targeted, stressed out, underslept, and trying to survive in an environment that routinely traumatizes you and from which there isn't any immediate solution. Since societal progress for those in need is slow, non-linear, and held up by an age group and tax bracket that are more likely to stroke out on live TV than they are to extend support to the working class. Note, said support becomes less likely the more of those previously mentioned identities are in tow. And while we're on the subject of working, it should be noted that experiencing any combo of anhedonia, depression, or ADHD is going to be even more difficult if you are also performing work that you derive no meaning or joy from, as is the case with many jobs under late-stage capitalism, because it means that the available hours that you could be mining for dopamine through good or rewarding experiences are being shortened to a small amount of free time before bed. A significant part of that small amount of time is going to be spent on chores, errands, and feeding yourself before you fall over and startle anyone who is nearby, leaving an incredibly narrow window in which you have time to do things that might bolster the chemical state of your skull, all while anhedonia makes those things about as effective as jerking it to Composition C, the painting that answered the question, what if the shit I doodled in geometry class could be sold for $50 million? So questioning exactly how much of the things in your life are perhaps causing or making symptoms worse is really important in order to give you an accurate idea of what your treatment options are, as well as how effective they will be, because even if you are fortunate enough to have access to medical care, you're interacting with it in a system that may not take your circumstances into account. They may just shove a fistful of pills at you and send you on your way, and this could leave you at somewhat of a loss, hopping from medication to medication, all while wondering why nothing seems to touch the prevailing sense of dread you've been living under, perhaps even giving you a few unpleasant side effects in the process, adding one more irritant to an already abraded mental state. This is especially likely if you have the budget for pills but not an extensive psychological analysis that will start at your crippling fear of spiders and end at the chemical state of your ventral tegmental area, which your psychiatrist will take note of with 3 frowny faces and a sticker that says needs improvement if you're to survive long enough for us to bill your insurance. And it is at this point that I should mention, medicalization of distress aside, please for the love of all that is unholy, do not suddenly go cold turkey on any meds you've been prescribed based on anything I've said. I am not a healthcare professional, and your care provider is going to be a lot more versed in your chemical state than a YouTuber who spends the majority of their time impersonating Princess Peach for fun and profit. Suddenly stopping meds can come with crazy side effects and even threaten your ability to have a pulse. Some of you have browsing histories that will need to be wiped with a blowtorch and a shovel, and you can't be assuring the designation of that task if you kick the bucket unexpectedly, phone unlocked, and with enough archive of our own bookmarks to make your family feel some type of way at your funeral. I am giving you all this info in order that you might be better prepared to address the difficulties you endure in your life and thus seek treatment with them in mind. And with all that said, now that we've taken note of the massive environmental elephant in the room, we'll move on to the 7th section entitled Brain No Worky, What Do? I considered calling it Treatment Under Late-Stage Capitalism, but I thought some of you might start foaming at the mouth. We're starting by addressing one of the most effective strategies to combat anticipatory anhedonia that you can do right now. And the great news is that you've already got the first step out of the way. Because the first and frankly most crucial step in combating anhedonia is knowing that you even have it. My living with it unaware cost me 2 years that I could have been treating it and not sinking into a pit that felt nigh impossible to climb out of. And while what I'm about to say isn't a cure, if you have the anticipatory variety of anhedonia, acting on the knowledge that your brain might be wrong about whether or not you'll enjoy things will be a massive step towards gathering good feelings as well as reclaiming a sense of who you are and what you enjoy. You can think of it as not putting your trust in a blindfolded weatherman and instead actually going outside to see if it's raining. And again, while this is not something that will necessarily fix your anhedonia, it will make living with it while you move towards treatment significantly less likely to go in hand with grippy socks and the confiscation of your belt. In short, if you have anticipatory anhedonia, the rule is to ignore your brain's forecast, try engaging in a thing that you used to like, and see for yourself if you enjoy it. If you do, congrats on the natural boost of dopamine. Now rinse and repeat with the other stuff you liked before, and give yourself a pat on the back for coming far enough that you have now surpassed the neurochemical state of your average wicker basket. Note that I led with the most cost-free and significant coping mechanism for a reason, partially because I want you to have something actionable before the thought of absorbing any more information makes you consider throwing your phone into the ocean, and because once you know that you haven't actually lost yourself, that there is a way for your life to get better and that you can do something to fight back, hope follows. And hope will keep you alive. It will keep you going despite the circumstances you might have to overcome, because we are only truly imperiled when we cease to hope, when we surrender our spirits and let the world we were simply born into dictate who we are and what we'll be. And when the day is done, it's hope that says a better tomorrow is worth fighting for. Even if, in this context, it means fighting an economic system that seems hell-bent on replacing anyone making under 6 digits with a robot in order to get basic medical care that most countries hand out to their citizenry like prophylactics at a pride parade. As we're about to talk about a bunch of medical treatments, I would like to reiterate that I am not a doctor, despite my penmanship resembling the maze on the back of a cereal box. And with that said, what the research says is that when it comes to treatment of anhedonia, it's best to treat the condition that came before it. This is because, quote, there isn't a specific treatment for anhedonia, meaning a healthcare provider will help alleviate this symptom by diagnosing and treating the cause or underlying condition as per the Cleveland Clinic. A required strategy, since there are no Be Happy Now drugs that aren't being sold in the bathrooms of nightclubs, the abuse of which can, ironically, lead to an onset of anhedonia, as well as having made out with someone that you wouldn't want to see in the unmerciful light of day. Treating the core condition means returning to that aforementioned Russian nesting doll and popping off the outer layers until you reach the disorder likely to have set off all the rest. You're essentially searching for what put your life on a trajectory to melt down sometime in your late 20s or mid-30s. And while this essay's focus is primarily on co-occurring depression and ADHD being the core conditions we're looking for, you should know that, according to a previous source, Anhedonia also has links to, quote, substance dependence, anxiety, self-deletion related events, PTSD, autism, Parkinson's disease, stroke, and some chronic medical conditions. So don't be surprised if that nesting doll seems to have a few more layers than you expected. That's somewhat a matter of course when you've lived your entire life white-knuckling basic tasks, closing doors extra quiet in your childhood home, and trying not to melt down anytime someone isn't actively assuring you that they're not angry. They promise, please stop crying in this crowded Applebee's parking lot. With that context provided, if the center of your Russian nesting doll is depression with anhedonia as its outer layer, treatment for you may look like 1. Medications that target dopaminergic receptors or norepinephrine in tandem with an SSRI. Norepinephrine is a chemical that is made from dopamine and, quote, plays an essential role in the regulation of arousal, attention, cognitive function, and stress reactions. An example of this combo would be taking something like however you pronounce this medication and an SSRI, since it's, quote, shown to be more effective at treating symptoms related to motivational and consummatory anhedonia, generally well tolerated, and can boost antidepressant response while reducing SSRI or SNRI associated sexual side effects, a factor that would give some patients one less thing to be depressed about, given that it should keep their dick from reenacting the fall of Saigon. Second on the list is cognitive behavioral therapy, a psychotherapy that, according to the American Psychological Association, is essentially a method of learning to recognize one's distortions in thinking in order to help you challenge unhelpful/negative thought patterns, use problem-solving skills to cope with difficult situations, face fears instead of falling into avoidance, use roleplay to test out conflicts with others, and should come with the warning, may cause you to intellectualize your emotions. Please do not boink the NPCs while roleplaying, and be advised that we will not be held responsible if your therapist begins communicating to you between asterisks. You are advised to leave the chat immediately before you read things that cannot be unread. The third option is zapping your brain until morale improves via electroconvulsive therapy. Its name immediately brought about the image of strapping someone to an asylum chair before taking out a cattle prod and showing little interest in patient discomfort. However, it's actually done with little electrodes on your head, has scientific merit in cases that don't respond to meds, and is far more boring than menacing someone with an electric stick. Fourth is transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is where medical professionals send magnetic waves through certain parts of your brain to stimulate the electricity involved in neural activity. This disappointingly doesn't involve rubbing someone's face with a fridge magnet until you can bill them for your time. And the magnet used is apparently incredibly strong and is also helpful for people who don't respond to other treatments, which has to be a particular blow to experience since I presume their provider emits the heaviest of sighs and then begins to take out the biggest magnet you've ever seen. Fifth up is ketamine injections. Ketamine is both expensive and still only approved by the FDA as an anesthetic, and given that according to Attitude magazine, it's still considered experimental, the risk of spending up to $800 per dose that you need to take 6 times and perhaps getting no benefit from it makes it an attractive option for people who want to know what color money turns when you set it on fire. Presumably after they've tried sticking a Flintstone magnet to your forehead and tasing you with medical intent. Which pulls us into our 6th option, known as hospital and residential treatment, that according to the Mayo Clinic is used when you can't care for yourself or are a direct threat to your own life and limb, the use of which may come with a bill for all your earthly possessions post-release. It's incredibly reminiscent of a time that I ended up in the hospital for piercing heart pain. It turned out to be stress-related, and they sent me home with a bill for $4 grand, thus solidifying that the American healthcare system has no appreciation for irony, and that a billing department will follow you just short of the darkest depths of the Mariana Trench. Our 7th suggestion covers at-home strategies to keep you going until you can get treatment, like getting regular exercise, quality sleep, eating a healthy diet, avoiding alcohol, spending time with people you care about, and managing stress. Writing "Don't be poor" would have been faster. And jokes aside, if you have the time, funds, or energy to do any of the things on the at-home list, no matter how small, it does make a difference and will absolutely be better than doing nothing in your effort to counter the effects of anhedonia and depression. The point is that I know that many of these things can be a struggle for someone whose time, money, and energy poor, so go easy on yourself if you can't fully utilize them in your current state. Because every little bit of good brain chemicals you can manage to get your gray matter to kick out counts, especially when the alternative is living like an abandoned Tamagotchi whose owner stopped paying attention to you after acquiring a hit clips player, a bead kit, and/or one of those art supply boxes that had the quality control of a 1960s institution for the clinically insane. This brings us to our 8th and final option, and returning to anhedonia, a concept analysis analysis, since most studies indicate that anhedonia in the depressed and schizophrenic populations tend to have deficits in the anticipatory but not consummatory pleasure, the trick I taught you about not trusting the blindfolded weatherman when it comes to the forecast of what you'll enjoy stands. To reiterate, having anticipatory anhedonia means your brain could have so little dopamine in pathways related to expecting pleasure that it can convince you that you don't look forward to or like any of the things that brought you joy. So you're going to need to ignore your thoughts and just do your favorite things in order to have a good time. This strategy proved most helpful for me at the beginning to build momentum and should allow you to work towards gathering the positive experiences that are incredibly important to your mental health, like hobbies, friends, and not lying on the bathroom floor until forcibly removed by people who are both concerned and fidgeting in ways that say you have about 5 seconds before you witness something that's usually only observed by toddlers, dogs, and that one cat who thinks you're constantly at risk of spontaneously drowning. More than anything, if I've done my work right, it should allow you the same hope and actionable strategy that helped me crawl out of the subject of our second to last section. Welcome to Section 8, Treatment for Anhedonia, Depression, and ADHD, all at the same time. You finally made it to the dead middle of the 3-car pileup of mental health proportions. And given that there's a bit of overlap between treatments, and some of you seem to be eyeing blunt objects with ill intent, I'm going to list these as quickly as possible before moving on to treatment specific to ADHD as the core issue. So if you've made it through this section without beating a stranger with your phone, you might walk away with strategies to get your brain to stop acting like an understimulated ferret. 1, and starting with the overlap, familiar treatment options include cognitive behavioral therapy, antidepressant medications that target norepinephrine, electrocution, and using magnets in hopes of making your neural activity resemble something less overtly depressing. 2, you might be presented with ADHD-specific strategies like Chad's suggestion of organizing and time management skills that rely on rewards as a motivator, which anhedonia will render ineffective and depression will make you feel bad about when you inevitably relapse into being a space cadet that can't tell a Tuesday from a rat's left testicle. 3, you can help yourself cope at home by boosting dopamine and norepinephrine via exercise and, quote, engaging in activities that make you happy, according to the Cleveland Clinic, as well as promote your body's ability to create said chemicals via sleep and a healthy, diverse diet, advice that will help you if you have enough time in your day to cook as well as run when you're not being chased. And finally, 4, if you're not keen on any of the other options, the most effective strategy for dealing with ADHD is to buy a planner, write down the day of your appointment with a nurse practitioner, receive a diagnosis, throw the planner out, and then microdose meth until your dopamine saturation reaches levels above a freshly dug up corpse. Mind you, we're talking about something that's only chemically similar to meth in the form of Adderall. Please do not go looking for your local flophouse, as meth is orders of magnitude more dangerous and liable to render your brain unable to experience joy if you make it that far without being shanked by someone who will cause your funeral to be a closed casket affair. That said, in all seriousness, the 4th and most efficacious treatment to try with ADHD with co-occurring depression and anhedonia across the board is stimulants. And the argument for their ability to help you topple the entire nesting doll is as follows. First, quote, treatment of ADHD can improve the symptoms of other disorders, largely by reducing stress and improving executive function, which has a direct effect on your ability to contend with any co-occurring conditions. Second, since stimulant-based treatment is effective in 70% of patients with ADHD, as seen in this article from the National Library of Medicine, and there's repeated evidence that has shown how imperative it is to try them. And third, if you're dealing with depression and anhedonia that were brought on by untreated ADHD, treating the ADHD may save you immense time and effort since, quote, unlike other psychiatric disorders, there is strong evidence for medication management without therapy as being the most efficacious, suggesting that you don't need someone to dig into your weird fascination with the fox from Robin Hood in order to clear up some chemical deficiencies in your brain. And this means that if your central nesting doll truly is ADHD, and you receive proper treatment, not only may it help alleviate the depression and anhedonia brought on by a lifetime of dopamine dysregulation, even if it doesn't send them into remission entirely, treating the ADHD will put your brain in a better place to deal with the other two conditions through clearing the brain fog, giving you back your energy, and allowing your mind enough resources to start hauling your ass out of the swamp of despair and hopefully towards the valley of not feeling like other shit all the time. With the occasional exception of a random Thursday where you remember the shit you used to put up with from your ex, the full body cringe of which unfortunately cannot be combated by medical science. Note from April of 2025 after a little more experience. Before we get any further into the video, I want to take a moment to address that if you're experiencing burnout, stomach lining, or digestive issues, suffering under abuse, or any other situation in which you're feeling absolutely fried, disclosing this to your medical practitioners is incredibly important both for treatment and for making sure that you don't jump on a course of meds that are liable to raise your cortisol levels and exacerbate the condition of your mind and body. That is to say that, from personal experience, it is best not to drop a bunch of stimulants on a weakened digestive system or brain that's been using stress to cope for so long that adding any more stimulation may as well be like attaching a pair of jumper cables to a potato. You're just going to feel like an overfried tater tot. Any resulting effects on sleep could further weaken your initial recovery. And while you should absolutely operate on the advisement of your doctor, don't be disappointed if it turns out that you need to first prioritize fighting anticipatory anhedonia, depression, and ADHD with non-medical resources before you're deemed suitable to chemically bully your brain into doing basic tasks. Things like sun and nature exposure, a healthy diet, exercise within your means, calling on your social supports, and other seemingly small but incredibly important steps towards overall wellness are incredibly helpful, even if getting yourself to do them is really fracking hard. And I'll end this little section addendum with a reminder that your home or work environment could very well be playing a massive role in your mental state, and given the overlap in expressed symptoms between those with ADHD and those under incredible amounts of stress or duress, the journey of unraveling the tangled strands that led you to this video will be a worthwhile task, as there is no amount of meds that will fix living in a bad situation. So go on your little hot person walk, try to eat a vegetable as if you aren't under threat of waterboarding, and get back to me. Once the correct dosage is found, this should increase your ability to act on things that will help you work towards better mental health, and while it may not directly impact the struggle you experience at the intersection of your various identities within modern economic systems which are recent and may disadvantage ADHD brains, considering that, quote, up until about 10,000 years ago, all human beings had to hunt and gather food, which we were probably good at. That is, until the advent of agriculture meant that brains that could do boring shit over a prolonged time period performed better, and now you practically have to check your dildo to make sure it doesn't contain traces of wheat, tree nuts, or dairy. You might find some parallels between long, boring work in the fields and the prolonged mental toll of many modern jobs today. And whether you put stock in that theory on suitability or not, if you have a genetic code that is more inclined to help you run from predators than it is to help you occupy a checkout stand for 9 hours per day, where the only threats on deck have inverted bob cuts, and your most rewarding moment involves peeing on company time, and you have all 80 of the HD, you might want to look into stimulants before your patience runs out and you smack the next person in line with a frozen bag of peas. Mind you, extended therapy would probably still greatly benefit you to process all the shit you've been through over the years, so I wouldn't rule it out as an option, but I'm currently focused on getting you Schedule II drugs under late-stage capitalism, and most of you don't yet have the energy budget to unpack the entirety of your life to a divorced father of 3 with a doctorate in psychiatry. Which, if I can distract you for a second, reminds me of a fun tidbit I found in a paper that studied divorce rates for those who believed in Santa or were general practitioners or psychiatrists. You might be surprised to learn that the one you pay to give you brain meds came out with the highest rate of failed marriages. Apparently the stats are stacked against your union if you decide to specialize in the head, a specialty that likely stopped at the bedroom door and thus explains the trail of ex-wives, but that's just conjecture coming from a woman who's dated men in America, so do take anything I say as gospel truth. That unassailable fact aside, the 2 primary stimulants you need to know about are amphetamines and methylphenidates. Both, quote, block the reuptake of dopamine at the presynaptic membranes and postsynaptic membranes, which in non-SAT terms means, congrats, there's now more dopamine in your your head, and it's going to places that will allow you to do basic household tasks without someone having to threaten you with a shovel. And while both types can have side effects in patients, the most common ones being decreased appetite, weight loss, and difficulty sleeping, according to Cleveland Clinic, as well as lesser ones like rebound effect, anxiety, tics, upset stomach, minor growth delay in children, and changes in blood pressure and heart rate. Finding the right one at the correct dose should greatly reduce or eliminate any issues and is well worth the process that may entail, since your other option is to continue as you were, which we both know sent you to a site of the internet that looks like a Technicolor threat and sounds like a news anchor for a broadcast that has long been canceled, largely due to colorful language and partially due to threatening to punt the station manager in places that cannot be described on live TV. Frankly, I'd suggest you get help if the algorithm even thinks you should be watching this channel. And to get back to what we were discussing before, when it comes to frontline treatment for ADHD, which are amphetamines and methylphenidates, there is some difference between the two stimulant types, since while both block the reuptake of dopamine, meaning it stays in your system longer, amphetamines also directly release dopamine on top, and there are multiple formulations of both, like immediate or extended release, as well as long-acting or sustained, the choice of which is best discussed with whatever healthcare professional you can get your hands on without it being declared a hostage situation. Which means that capitalism has re-entered the chat, and I can welcome you to our 9th and final section for the evening called How to Get Treatment for ADHD on a Budget. The budget in this instance being 2 Pokemon cards and a prayer. Most of the advice to follow also applies if you replace ADHD with depression, and this section will help you to navigate acquiring treatment with or without insurance, like getting your first couple of appointments, testing, then diagnosis and medication, which usually add up swiftly before you throw the ongoing shortage of ADHD meds in the US on top, which amounts to the 2 primary hurdles you must surmount to get the pharmacists to hand you controlled substances instead of chasing you out of CVS with a stick. Fortunately, as per the CHAD organization, there are resources available to help you financially, but it will take research to find those that suit your specific circumstances. Research that is also needed when it comes to meds, as it appears to operate on an ask-around basis, which, I'm not even kidding, currently seems to work on whether or not your provider knows a guy who has the stuff. We're talking a difference between some pharmacies having a waiting list of 2 months and others practically waiting at the counter with bottled water in a funnel, so definitely check around for local availability before you send your prescription to a place that may have you waiting around until the next coming of your psychiatrist's wife. I'm including a link to Chad's list of tips for getting ADHD treatment in the description, but before I cover the ones I find most helpful, you'll need to know what getting said treatment entails and quickly put, an incredibly simple diagnosis process for ADHD might look like the following. First comes the consultation. You'll describe symptoms and what brought you to seek care. Another appointment may be scheduled to gauge said symptoms, followed by an online or in-person QB test that is purported to measure inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. It will accurately measure if you fidget like a balding parrot, and your care practitioner will schedule another appointment to review your results along with the issues you've self-reported, proceed to make a diagnosis, and submit an order for the lowest dose of meds they think might be effective. Because slowly stair-stepping your concentration by 5 milligram intervals is the safest and most effective way to get you to a point where you are functioning and not streaking through a Trader Joe's whilst claiming to be a little lad that loves berries and cream. A few more appointments will follow, perhaps monthly or bi-weekly, until your dose reaches the correct amount, and then you may proceed with your life, having gained the brand new ability to remember why you entered a room. Thus concludes the snapshot of a very simple baseline of getting diagnosed. Please note your results may vary and could be more complicated should you possess several other issues like PTSD, restless leg syndrome, or are currently experiencing visions of a dark future where your TikTok FYP is beset by people making allusions to thoroughly defiling a popcorn bucket. This joke will be utterly irrelevant by the time this video comes out, and I know that, so I just wanted you to suffer. But enough about what the algorithm thinks I should be looking at 50 times a day. Let's look at Chad's tips and tricks for getting Schedule II drugs on a budget. Note that I put these in my own order and tossed out all the hard work they put in theirs. Starting with tip 1, that I think is most important, try to find a practitioner that lists ADHD as a specialty. It's no joke that ADHD diagnosis is already hyper-focused on children to the extent that even the CDC shunts the section for adults to the very bottom of its page on the disorder, so the least you can do for yourself is to try to find a provider who knows enough about it to not figuratively ask you to put your mother on the phone. This goes double extra if your gender identity hasn't been recently tested on its ability to wipe ketchup off a counter, and practitioners will usually have some list of their special fields on their online profiles, so check that out before they write off any symptoms you're experiencing. Scribble too many titties for ADHD diagnosis, or in the margins, patient was unfortunately not a 12-year-old boy. Moving on from the very surprising medical sexism that absolutely wasn't predictable at all, tip 2 is to see if your county has a behavioral or mental health clinic that can assist with evaluation and treatment. Services may be provided on a sliding scale based on need and whether or not your income is sufficient to keep you from decorating a street corner, as well as group therapy sessions that Chad says might be more affordable than individual therapy, which includes the lovely experience of discussing your embedded mental hangups in a room full of people just like you. Personally, I'd rather vomit up thumbtacks, but some people apparently feel comforted by bonding with other human beings. If you can't stomach sitting in a converted gymnasium that still smells like basketball practice from the 1980s, tip 3 is to search for hospital-based clinics that offer sliding scale services. Some of them may use interns and residents in training to provide treatment, so you could perhaps save money and watch someone in their mid-20s sweat out an entire triple shot macchiato while their supervising physician looms over their shoulder like the shadow of their parents' expectations. 50 Cent says they throw up after the appointment, and tip 4 is to look for any county medical clinics where you live that provide care for, quote, uninsured families with low incomes, includes links that I will add to the description for the United States, and means that other countries likely have something similar and or better on the basis of not living in the one that is currently replacing healthcare with a hostage situation should they find out you're transporting a fetus across state lines. If anyone knows someone doing low-cost bilateral salpingectomies, do send them my way. And that aside, tip 5 says to see if there's any affordable programs being offered by colleges that train future mental and physical health professionals, wherein you could get more affordable care if you're willing to be diagnosed by someone who's violently hungover, resents the sunlight, and is absolutely planning to do everything that put them in this position over again the very moment they're done deciding you have the dopaminergic activity of a root vegetable. Tip 6 is to volunteer to be a lab rat for a research study that would qualify you for ADHD assessment and treatment, and I'd recommend you avoid sudden movements, as researchers are often jumpy around anything that doesn't beep, squeak, or solicit them for their life's work in exchange for having it featured in a for-profit journal. Tip 7 suggests that you check to see if you qualify for Medicaid or contact your county social services for help with finding funding for services and treatment, which basically implies to try to wring something out of whatever tax dollars aren't currently tied up in getting the police force a new tank. Tip 8 is that if science or public services fail, you can turn to organizations of your sky daddy of choice. Churches may even offer limited financial assistance as well as unlimited opportunities to explain every tattoo you've ever gotten. Tip 9 says the Department of Vocational Rehabilitation in each state provides assessments, financial assistance, referrals to training programs, and counseling to adults with disabilities. This includes people who can't properly regulate some major neurochemicals like those with ADHD, which finally leaves us at tip 10, and by no means the last on Chad's list, but the final one I'm willing to cover at the risk of several of you reaching through the phone and begging me to put you out of your misery. The last bit that I didn't even know before digging into this research is that apparently short-release versions of stimulants for ADHD are often cheaper even though they need to be taken multiple times a day. This is as opposed to their extended release variants, whether they be generic or the type that has nationwide ads featuring an unassuming white lady whose screen presence says, "What if they put an aging Disney star out to pasture and made them sell drugs?" Don't pretend you can't hear the tone she's using through this image alone. We both know it's something to the effect of wry grin that will be broadly inoffensive across a wide range of demographics. That's the final bit of advice I have for you in one sitting, thus abruptly wrapping several months of my life I spent working on this video. The initial few, completely unmedicated, and drowning in the pitfalls opening in my own brain like a frog in a chlorinated swimming pool, I existed as suburban flotsam until I was introduced to the concept of Anhedonia that set everything you've seen here in motion. A moment I can't even tell you about since my brain fog was so intense that the memories pre-diagnosis are a haze of dopamine-seeking behavior, bleaching my hair in place of seeking medical attention, and eventually a hospitalization for a life-threatening inflammation that nearly entirely blocked the area between my stomach and esophagus and was directly related to the stress caused by a combination of untreated anhedonia, depression, and ADHD. In In short, my coping mechanisms combined with mental duress, Anhedonia and the two other cohorts added heat to the fire, and that combo cooked for 2 years as I abused myself with enough caffeine to burn a hole in a steel pot, swallowed it down with Jack Daniels and ibuprofen on the weekends, and culminated in an emergency room visit at 12 a.m. on a Friday, trying to convince the staff that I wasn't on drugs while dressed like someone who looks like they'll snort anything that isn't nailed down. No one could understand how I walked in there on my own 2 feet after my results came in, as according to them, I should have been unconscious, vomiting, or both. And had I gone home and continued to try to eat or drink instead of going to the hospital, I probably would have died in my room, never knowing that I was practically a walking statistic. One more casualty of sexism in medical research to throw on the pile, along with all the other AFAB and gender non-conforming bodies that lie undiagnosed due to something far too clinical sounding to encapsulate loss. How are you supposed to explain to a family that bias in assessment criteria took their loved one away? But if lack of information can take a life, then access to it can prevent its loss. And the reason I'm telling you even that much of my own story is that I want to impress on you how serious implications can be if the disorders we've discussed today are left untreated over a long enough timeline. And worse, without intervention, their combined impact builds on itself. And while I may have only lived with anhedonia for 2 years, struggling with undiagnosed ADHD cost me nearly 2 decades that I can't get back in missed opportunities, stress, social struggles, sleepless nights trying to catch up, and severe depression that it is directly responsible for that has been following me around since before I was 13 and dangling my future like a candle in the wind. I also gave you my story so that you would honor the validity of your own. Because I know in my bones that as hard as it was for me, had I lived in a neighborhood or home saturated in physical violence, held any number of at-risk racial or sexual identities, or had access to a gun, I wouldn't be here. I know the struggles many of you have carried throughout your life are a burden that I can intellectually understand, not personally hold, but I bring them up in hopes that it will validate how far you've come and remove even an ounce of the guilt you've borne for living so far from what you feel is your true potential, feeling like you're ever sliding backwards and trying so hard just to stay in the same place you've always been. I hope you get to a place where you can acknowledge how much you've done by staying, how much lies ahead of you if you can just hang on, what life will have in store for you after you get the help you need and are able to drop burdens that should have been lifted out of your tiny hands well before you reach the age where you had to hold them on your own. To close, my story has a somewhat statistically predictable ending. I got diagnosed, prescribed proper medication, and am living my life as if I didn't spend the majority of it struggling with something so stupidly easy to fix with a few pills. And now that it is all just gone, and the lifetime of depression and years of anhedonia have been swept out by a low dose of Adderall, I am left with this feeling of anger. Something you might feel too after your own diagnosis, because it's normal to be mad that the solution for something that ruined your life is a couple of tablets that could fit on your pinky that no one told you about when it would have mattered, and all it took was a signature on your prescription from someone whose writing style looks like a Rorschach test fucked an electrocardiogram of a patient going into anaphylactic shock. And eventually that feeling will simmer down into relief. And with any luck, over enough time, being able to function when you need to, do things when you want to, and take care of yourself like you deserve to, will become normal. And with any luck, something I've said here today will help you get there. So in conclusion, if you're depressed, experiencing a lowered capacity for pleasure, develop some kind of stomach issue, stressed to hell, and can't seem to get to the end of a sentence without having to go back and forth over it like some kind of malfunctioning fax machine, then you should probably get screened for ADHD. This has been Tyler. You've been watching the channel with my fracking name on it, and I'd like to thank my patrons for sticking around long enough for me to go through several crises, end up hospitalized, pop up and disappear like some kind of prairie dog, nearly flatline again, and then return to them with the longest dive into a trio of mental disorders I could possibly produce in 3 months, with only one of them being properly medicated under the supervision of a trained professional. The Adderall has obviously not done anything about my tendency to weaponize harmonize the length of my sentences, and should you like to suffer through more of them or see what I do next, you can head over to patreon.com/lastweeklolitanews, where the next video is already up, and I am likely not because I've spent my time pouring through yet another research paper that has the palatability of an unsalted cracker. Because creative wordplay is banned in scientific research in order that it not be misconstrued or accidentally made enjoyable to read, I am now out of words and will go lie down. Thanks again, guys, and I'll catch you next time. Also, if you made it this far and you want to suggest a topic for me to cover, I'll consider it for the next thing I dedicate my life to, hopefully for a shorter duration.